am Ryan Reft. I'm a historian in the manuscript division, where I oversee collections pertaining to 20th and 21st century history. And I'm happy to have everyone here to talk about home rule at 50. Before I get started, though, I just want to have a couple thank yous, because events, because I hope some of you folks will check out the concert afterwards. Events like this take a lot of people to put them together. They are not a product of one person, but obviously a team. So first, I want to say thank you to the manuscript division. First, to the reference librarians, archivists, technicians, and historians in the division who make it such a great place to work. And if you get a chance, check out the display after the event. But also I want to thank my division chief, Janice Ruth, and our head of acquisitions and outreach, Bridget Burke, who have been enormously supportive throughout the process of building this event. Secondarily, I'd like to thank the development office, Kathy Milliken and Andrew McCarthy-Clark, for funding and organizationally supporting the event as well, and to Susan Vita, head of music, for supporting the concert after with Mambo Sauce. And to the MMG production team, Latasha Bullard, Alejandro Badini, and Chris Kilcullen, for all the work both on the LJ119 event here and the Mambo Sauce event after in the Coolidge. Did I mention that there's a concert in the Coolidge afterwards? Finally, to events, Rebecca Roberts and Elizabeth Schreiber-Byers. Elizabeth Schreiber-Byers, you may have seen outside the display. She was critical in kind of like helping me think about this event more broadly and put it together. In fact, her idea for the go-go band was hers, and deeply appreciate it. And Rebecca was enormously helpful in all aspects of execution here. So, what are we doing here? We're here for home rule, right? So a little bit about myself and why I was interested in this subject. I actually grew up in Chicago, a city famous for voting. Perhaps in a different way than here. In Chicago, the attitude is vote early, vote often. And, dead people like to vote. So, and I grew up there in the 80s and 90s. So much like after the machine as it's collapsing. And yet, the narrative locally and nationally about Chicago is tied to its kind of orgy-related relationship to voting, right? It's like, it's corrupt, but yet it's a central aspect of the identity of the city. So when I moved to DC in 2011 to finish up my grad degree, the idea of a city whose history where people didn't vote or didn't even have the option was just kind of remarkable to me. And I was an urban historian at the time, and so it really fascinated me. And I think what's critical here is that DC is all cities I think have a national perspective, but DC in particular is both local and national, right? I want to read a quote from a historian named Howard Gillette. "If any city in the United States has borne the burden of serving as a symbol of American aspirations and has simultaneously been the place where the issues of civilization have been focused, it has been the nation's capital." He wrote that in 1995, 30 years ago almost. I think it's as true today, and it probably was true 30 years before that. And I think the items we have on display in LJ119 speak to this, how this is both an issue that required intense local activism, but also required national activism and national legislation. Home rule really takes off as a civil rights issue in the 60s, and particularly through the leadership of Walter Fauntroy, who becomes the first DC delegate in 1971 and pushes for home rule, and because the League of Women Voters played a large role in helping to campaign for the DC delegate, which Walter Fauntroy, who is central to home rule in general, was critical to. So it took both local action, took national activism, and national legislation to affect a local municipal rule. So I think that's an interesting place to begin. And I think what we want to emphasize about home rule is that, yes, it absolutely has problematic aspects to it that the panel, I'm sure, will delve into. And undoubtedly, it is a political thing. There's no doubt that home rule is fundamentally political. But I think we're also thinking about this as, yes, it is political. But home rule also, starting in 74 after the elections, 73 is when the act was passed, also created a milieu, almost like a cultural history, to go with this political history. So basically, the political environment created the cultural environment, and that's why we're having the go-go band afterwards, because in a way, go-go is a cultural sibling to the political developments of the city. It grew out of the culture in the city, because even though there were limits on this municipal government, it did allow for expression, and it did allow for a black-led government that had not been possible before, and I think that's a real thing to point out. Now, we wanted to meld this national and local perspective because we are a national institution, right? But we're in the capital. But we wanted to pair with a local institution. And I think schools have always been at the intersection of politics and culture. And it's noteworthy to point out that before DC had home rule, about 6 years, they were electing a school board. And who gets on the school board in 72? A person named Marian Barry, who immediately becomes president of the school board, and a couple years later becomes arguably, well, not really arguably, the most famous mayor of DC in its history. So We had help from the music division Solo Halasi and Michelle Glimpf, who I forgot to thank, but they were both critical on this. And Solo was a graduate of Duke Ellington. He said, why don't you reach out to Duke Ellington? They have this great program on go-go and DC history that I think would go great with your program. So we reached out to Gabrielle Dubose and Marta Stewart, who both work at Duke Ellington, and who have spent years putting together museum studies and go-go and DC history classes for these students. And so we wanted to kind of come in at that intersection. And Gabrielle's going to come up and talk about her experience in Duke Ellington to present the panelists to get us kicked off. One note before I introduce Gabrielle is that at the end of the Q&A, there will be time for everyone to ask questions, but we are reserving the first 10 questions for the students from Duke Ellington, and I will have the mic, so once the students are done, just raise your hand, and I'll bring it over to you if you have questions. Now let me introduce Gabrielle. Is a veteran teacher of 30 years in private, charter, and public school education, a Washington, D.C. native. She's taught in Maryland, the Dallas, Texas area, and now in the Georgetown area of D.C. From 1995 to the present, Ms. Dubose made her life's mission to facilitate learning in the performing arts and in academics. In 1997, she was the founder of Wisdom School of Arts, a small performing arts school in Texas. From 2013 to now, she teaches at her alma mater, Duke Ellington School of Arts, where she facilitates the Writing Center and teaches incoming ninth graders an elective course exploring the history of the school, go-go music, and home rule. And with that, Gabrielle, come up and kick us off.
Thank you, Ryan, and good evening, everyone. Tonight we celebrate the 1973 Home Rule Act, Go-Go, DC's official music, and we can include Duke Ellington School of the Arts also celebrating 50 years. Let's clap it up. So while we pay homage to those three major milestones, Home Rule made it possible for the other two institutions to break through. The work in legacy building that began 50 years ago, December 24, 1973, must be protected, respected, supported, and passed to future generations. The work must continue. At Duke Ellington, I teach the whole child, the whole truth, which means informing all of my students about how once majority Black DC has a history steeped in not only civil rights, but DC rights for DC residents, especially folks that are traditionally left far from equity and inclusion. We talk about the rich history of the 60s and 70s that moved with purpose to help Blacks grow in business, in entertainment, and in education. On the heels of the 60s civil rights victories, Mike Malone and Peggy Cooper Cafritz did groundbreaking activism when they chose Georgetown out of the other possibilities they were offered as the location of the school, which indeed met some resistance by some who thought the school's place was elsewhere in the district. But bold action was not new to the Malone-Cafritz duo, whose work in DC began as Workshop for Careers in the Arts on the campus of George Washington University in 1968. Groundbreaking. Malone and Cafritz were activists determined to bring a measure of equity and inclusion to DC youth on the backdrop of the 73 Home Rule Act. You will hear from a few of my ninth grade students tonight and some of the first and third year students from Museum Studies Department in just a little while. Let's give the students another hand clap. Let's love them up, love on them. The students that take my class learn about the intentionality of what self-governance meant then and what it means today as we consider the work yet undone. They debate about finding their place in this work. Many of my students understand that their time is now. And so we must also know that preparation to pass that mantle is also now. The mantle can only hold real power, however, when all of history is taught. Moving with purpose is exactly what our ancestors, Chuck Brown, Mike Malone, Peggy Cooper Cafritz, and other generals of the movement did. They were purpose-filled and used what was at their access to bring change to DC. They charted a path of effective activism under the auspices of indigenous music and access to professional arts and academics programming, but all of that was to ensure that equity and inclusion did not skip generations of Black people in this city. Brown, Malone, and Cavers were activists who were serious about real change in DC. They took risks, and today we still reap the benefit of their work. In 1973, Home Rule helped keep the door open for Duke Ellington's founders and DC's homegrown go-go music so they could make their way onto the scene a little fuller and let the world know they were here and a force to be reckoned with. 50 years later, each work is still happening because of Home Rule and that measure of autonomy. The power of Home Rule must be felt for generations to come because the voice of DC citizens still calls for representation in the Senate, in economic development, and in education. My students understand the importance of governance that welcomes all voices that must be heard from the streets to Capitol Hill, where folks can have equal access as they deserve to the growing dynamic infrastructure known as the nation's capital. As I close, we owe it to our young people to not let the light dim on meaningful change in Washington, D.C. They deserve to know who they are in this city, what leadership roles they can access, and just how much their lives matter. Students here tonight will leave with a new charge because they've heard from officials who care about them and this city, and because of that, they too will hold DC accountable for its claims towards real change. Thank you. Now, please allow me to introduce to some or present to others our esteemed panelists for the evening. Shall they approach the stage as I call? Or okay. So let's begin with Kojo Nnamdi. Mr. Nnamdi is the host of the Politics Hour with Kojo Nnamdi, a live talk show produced by WAMU that airs Fridays at noon. Nnamdi joined WAMU in 1998 to host Public Interest, formerly known as the Derek Magenti Show. In 2002, the show was renamed as the Kojo Nnamdi Show, which he hosted until the show ended in April 2021. A longtime DC resident, Mr. Nnamdi immigrated to the United States in 1968 to attend college and explore the civil rights movement. He is also active in GUIAID, an organization devoted to the welfare of children in Guyana. Mr. Nnamdi served on the board of the Library of Congress American Folklife Center from 2003 to 2008. And now let's welcome to the stage Mr. Tom Sherwood. Mr. Sherwood is a veteran journalist of more than 55 years with experience in newspapers, television, radio, and social media. A native of Atlanta, Georgia, Tom, since 2009, has been the resident political analyst for the WAMU 88.5 Politics Hour with host Kojo Nnamdi, airing at noon on Fridays. Mr. Sherwood is also a contributing writer to the Washington City paper. He is co-author with Harry Jaffe of Dream City, Race, Power, and the Decline of Washington, D.C. Mr. Sherwood. And now let's keep clapping as we welcome George Derek Musgrove to the stage. Mr. Musgrove is an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He is the author of Black Power in D.C., a web-based map of Black Power activism in the nation's capital, and he's co-author with Chris Myers-Ash of Chocolate City, A History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital, among other works. He lives with his wife and 2 sons in Washington, D.C. Mr. Musgrove. And now to the ladies on the stage tonight. Put your hands together and welcome Ms. Kyla Sommers. Ms. Sommers is the author of When the Smoke Cleared, the 1968 Rebellions on the Unfinished Battle for Civil Rights in the Nation's Capital. Sommers earned her PhD in history from the George Washington University. Her writing has appeared in the Washington Post, the Washington History Journal, and the book Demand the Impossible, Essays in History as Activism. Sommers is the digital engagement editor at American Oversight and was previously the editor-in-chief of the History News Network. Ms. Sommers, everybody. And to our last panelist that's approaching the stage right now, Ms. Judy Richardson. Ms. Richardson was on the SNCC staff in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama from 1963 to 1966. She is currently co-directing the New Visitor Center film for the National Park Service's Frederick Douglass House in Washington, D.C. In 1968, she was founder of Drum and Spear Bookstore, once the country's largest African-American bookstore. She was on the production team for all 14 hours of the seminal PBS series Eyes on the Prize as its series associate producer, then its education director, and then continued to produce documentaries for PBS, the History Channel, and museums. She also co-edited Hands on the Freedom Plow, personal accounts by women in SNCC. Come on now, come on. A compilation of testimonies of 53 SNCC women. She is a member of the SNCC Legacy Project Board, the SNCC Digital Website Editorial Board, was a visiting professor at Brown University, and has an honorary doctorate from Swarthmore College. To our panelists this evening, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ms. DuBose. And good evening, everyone. All of the panelists this evening are very knowledgeable about the history of home rule in the District of Columbia and the activism that took place here that created an environment for that to be accomplished. They are all good talkers, so I'm going to tell them all, feel free to interrupt one another as we speak. Tom Sherwood does it to me every Friday. So feel free to do it to him and to anyone else who is speaking if you happen to be on the panel, and then of course we'll take questions from you. As an aside, I do have to tell you that my first employer in the District of Columbia, the first employer that ever gave me a paycheck, was Drum and Spear Bookstore, that was founded by Judy Richardson and others. So in large measure, they are responsible for my presence in Washington for these last 50 years or so. But I'd like to start from a historical point of view with you, Derek Musgrove, because advocates of home rule in Congress have been seeking to pass legislation for some 20 years by the early 1970s. Why the breakthrough in 1973? What changed?
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for the question, Kojo. And you know, I think that we're very used to partisan gridlock on the issue of DC self-determination today. You have sort of unified Republican opposition on one side, unified Democratic support on the other. And if you go back to late 1940s, 1950s, it wasn't like that at all. If you look at the Senate, even when the chambers changed hands, for the Senate DC committee, you had a Democrat, a gentleman named Neely from West Virginia, who was a backer of home rule legislation. When the Senate changed hands to Republicans, you had a guy from South Dakota named Case, the backer of home rule legislation. And for years, they passed home rule bill after home rule bill out of the Senate, sent them over to the House. When they got, and these were liberals in the Republican and the Democratic Party. When they got to the House, though, they faced a solid brick wall of segregationist opposition. And those segregationists were also bipartisan. And so you had a guy named John McMillan, who was from South Carolina, totally unconstructed segregationist, and he bottled up every single bill that came to him. He did not want home rule for the district. And so you face this problem where all these bills are coming through from the liberals in the Senate. They're getting killed by segregationists in the House. What changes in the early 1970s is that John McMillan is defeated. And he's defeated in large part because activists from DC go down to South Carolina and work with the 28% of the population in his district, the 6th District of South Carolina, who are African American, to turn out in huge numbers against him. And Walter Fauntroy, who is, of course, a pastor, New Bethel Baptist Church here on 9th Street, he's a veteran of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He works with all the pastors he can find in the 6th District and tries to get African Americans to turn out against McMillan. He tries first in 1970. He's unsuccessful. He tries again in 72. He is successful. And, people ask McMillan, so what happened? Why'd you lose the race? You've been in this seat for 20-odd years. And he says, well, the Negro vote was brought out against me. It's as simple as that. And there were a couple of white liberals as well who came out against him in that race. And after he loses, not just McMillan, and by the way, to give you an idea of sort of how racist he was, he'd sit down with Haynes Johnson, who was this great reporter who worked in the city for a couple of years in the 1960s, and he would just freely use the N-word to a reporter at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, right? He had a picture on his door of a Confederate soldier, and in his office door in the House office building, just to be clear. And once he leaves, a lot of the segregationists who were his buddies on the committee also leave at the same time. And so there's 6 Republicans and Democrats who are segregationists on the committee from the South and the Midwest in 1971. After he's defeated in 72, when the Congress reorganizes in 73, only one of them is still there. And the person who replaces McMillan on the D.C. committee in the House of Representatives is a guy named Charlie Diggs, who's a buddy of Walter Fauntroy's from Detroit, founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus, and a strong advocate of D.C. home rule. So home rule bill is carried by the new chair of the D.C. committee, and that's how you get the breakthrough.
But nevertheless, there were some, and later Judy Richardson can talk about the kind of environment that existed in the city during the late 1960s, but there were some, like Julius Hobson, who argued that home rule was woefully insufficient, that it was just a new form of colonization. Why? What did they think was wrong with the legislation?
It still is.
I told you he interrupts me all the time.
So, to Tom's point, I mean, there's this guy named Sam Smith, who's the editor of the East Capitol Gazette. And he was a good friend of Julius Hobson, famous statehood activist. And he calls the home rule bill participatory colonialism, right? And the reason he pointed that out was because he was an anti-highway activist. Congress wanted to plow a huge number of highways through the city. We were supposed to look like Houston. We were going to have an inner loop, a medium loop, and then an outer loop. The only one that got built was the outer loop. But the idea was that they wanted to stop these highways and save people's homes. I mean, they were going to plow these things straight through neighborhoods. It was going to displace about 30,000 people. And he was fighting against that. And he says, look, this home rule bill doesn't in any way, shape, or form stop that. Congress still has control. We get a government, that's great, but they have to approve our budget. The federal government is still appointing all the judges. All the things that we're fighting against, we'd still be fighting against them on the backside of this legislation. And so he really saw it as a half step. I think a lot of other people would say it was a half step that created a lot of space for local activists, but it was nonetheless a half step.
Why'd you say it still is?
Well, because I'd like to point out we're in this beautiful place, the Library of Congress, this room, which is in the District of Columbia, which is the nation's capital, but as I tell everyone I speak to, the nation's capital is the most un-American place in America. We are still treated as a colony. In recent battles over the speaker, who would be the Speaker of the House, which was great entertainment for those of us who like to watch those types of things, Ellen Holmes Norton, who's been our delegate to Congress since 1991, was not in the room. Called her up and asked her staff, where are you? And she was at various different places, but she had no vote in naming the speaker. That means we don't have a vote. And of course, we have no vote in the Senate on any of the issues. So it's unfortunate that as good as big step that home rule was in Richard Nixon signed it in December of 1973, and we had our first elected mayor and council. We still have all the chains that were put in. Even in 2020, after the George Floyd murder, and there was demonstrations here, and Trump was downtown, and people were worried about riots, and the people were demonstrating and all of that. I reminded people that there's a provision in our home rule charter that says the president at any time he or someday she wishes, can take over the DC Police Department for a minimum 48 hours. And then if he wants to hold the police department in his hands longer, he has to ask Congress, the House and Senate for approval. So we still have limited home rule. We always talk about home rule this and home rule that. I want to keep in mind it's limited home rule, which means you have limited rights.
Well,
and on that cheery note,
we heard the name Marian Barry mentioned, and of course you can't talk about DC politics without talking about Marian Barry, but when I arrived here in 1969, Marian Barry was heading an organization called Pride Incorporated, and as a result of the people I associated with, I found out that Marian Barry and others were originally from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then they came here and made a significant contribution to the general political environment in the black community, because these were the heady days of black power. And so we get to Judy Richardson. Talk about a little bit about what activism in the city was like during that time of the mid to late 60s.
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, I'm at a point where if I don't read notes, I will go on forever. So I'm going to read from some of this. Okay.
She'd go on forever anyway.
Yeah, that's true. He knows. First of all, when I come down, it's 1968, and when some of us SNCC folks started Drum and Spear Bookstore, it was like a coming home for the main founder and the one who proposed the store, Charlie Cobb, because his whole network was here. You know, his father was here, Reverend Charles Cobb. His mother was chair of the Romance Languages Department at Howard. Jimmy Cobb was an attorney here. His roots were here. But it was also like a coming home for a number of other folks who, like Cortland Cox and Charlie, had both gone to Howard. We wanted to bring the SNCC focus on organizing through community education to DC. And that was both through Drum and Spear Bookstore and then Drum and Spear Press, which we started afterward. And I should say, when I first saw Drum and Spear Bookstore, it was at 14th and Fairmont, and they had just yet again tear-gassed 14th Street. And I had just come down, I was going to Columbia. Somebody said, oh, come, help us start this bookstore. And Curtis Hayes, also in SNCC, I put a mattress on the car, and we drove the car down, and then the first time I see it, it's 14th Street is filled with tear gas. But what also brought us SNCC folk here was the creative and political energy that was surging through DC then. And we deliberately sited the store at 14th and Fairmont Northwest, which of course then was still a vital part of what was then Chocolate City. And it soon became the largest black bookstore in the country, as Kojo said. And we were selling not only to folks both inside the neighborhood and outside the neighborhood, but also to the DC's public schools, colleges like Cornell and UMass Amherst, and many other colleges. Tony Gittins, who many of you may know was the founder and is still the head of the Washington International Film Festival, 35, 40 years almost going. Well, he became the first manager of Drum and Spear, and he'd just come off Howard's campus after being one of the main organizers for the student takeover, the 1964 student takeover at Howard. Across the street on 14th Street from Drum and Spear was the Center for Black Education, which is where I first met Kojo. And in that Center for Black Education, we included a health clinic that provided free health care, provided by Howard med school students, classes in communication, which Kojo knows well, and the center also produced a weekly international news show, which was on WOL AM. Speaking of WOL, the bookstore also had a weekly children's radio show called Sayawa Toto.
Voice of the Children.
No, not yet, not yet really. It was actually, or the Children's Hour in the African language of Swahili. The reason I know this so well is because I was the host of it. I was Bibi Amina. And I would say, Kwahera Yakwanana at the end. It's the only time I ever knew a Swahili word. Kwahera Yakwanana, that's it. Okay, and Jambo. I said, Jambo, my young brothers and sisters. Anyway, too much, okay, TMI. So, we had all of that going, and we would do African-related and third world-related children's stories, and it would be on WOL. So Down 14th Street, though, was the new school for African American thought, started by the poet Gaston Neal, and he hosted poetry events, which would now be called poetry slams, but we just call them events. And then down 18th Street was the New Thing Art and Architecture Center, which was founded by Topper Carew. And all of these entities, all these Black institutions, had a symbiotic relationship. In fact, Drum and Spear Press, I should mention, by the way. Yeah. Okay, so, for example, this was Children of Africa. Oh, thank you very much. Children of Africa.
I'm useful for something.
Hello. That's right, Vanna White. Children of Africa, that was done by Drum and Spear Press, right? And we carried in the store. And what was wonderful is that Jennifer Lawson, who later becomes head of all programming for PBS, and then left as senior VP for technology at CPB, which is, Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Okay, she did all the illustrations because she had been an illustrator for the Black Panther in Lowndes County, Alabama, for SNCC. So she knew graphics, but she's still doing artwork. Okay, so and then the other one. Okay, we also did. And the illustrator for that, by the way, that was Jennifer. But the illustrator for this one is Bubbles, and Bubbles was done by DC author Eloise Greenfield, who becomes a well-known children's book author, right? But we were the first publishers for her because we had Drum and Spear Press. And I remember when I first got the transcript, too much information. Anyway, bottom line, we published it. And the illustrations for that were done by an illustrator, an artist at the New Thing Art and Architecture Center at the 18th Street thing. So all of these are Black institutions working with each other to help each other with whatever goals they had. And so these are the folks who are involved, the folks who are involved in the DC statehood campaign lent energy to and were energized by the incredible cultural and political grounding that were in the Black institutions. So that's it, yeah.
And this was a time when two former chairpersons of SNCC, correct me if I'm wrong, were in Washington a lot. One of them was Stokely Carmichael, who later became known as Kwame Ture, and another, I think, who was the first chairman of SNCC when it was formed, was a man named Marian Barry, who was also here. I remember working...
And Johnny Wilson.
And Johnny Wilson
was
who
a SNCC person.
Who eventually was on the DC Council. I remember
and the name of the building, the council building.
The Wilson building is named after John Wilson, who was the chairman of the DC Council at the point at which he passed. But I remember working at Drum and Spear Bookstore and being asked to mount a book exhibit at a school board meeting at a time when Marian Barry was the chair of the school board. And the school board meeting got so raucous that Marian walked out and never mentioned that we were having a book display there. And on his way out, I was like, what happened with the book display? You never mentioned the book display. He said, yeah, y'all buy some books over here. So, but this was the environment at the time, an environment that you talked about at length in your book, Kyla Sommers, because DC had recently experienced mass uprisings after the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, and your work examines the activism, some of which Judy just described, that preceded and followed these uprisings. How did that activism, that environment, relate to home rule?
So people like Marian Barry and Stokely Carmichael had identified the importance of DC and home rule before the uprisings, as I call them, and it followed after. So Marian Barry and Walter Fauntroy created Free DC, and they went all along H Street and to other businesses and said, if you don't support home rule, then we're going to boycott you. And this was going along with decades of activism, because those same small businesses were the same businesses that activists had been picketing and boycotting and organizing against because they were segregationists. And so it flowed for decades forward, and they said, now we're gonna picket you because you're the biggest obstacle to home rule, because they were all members of the Board of Trade, which had had an enormous amount of power under congressional rule. They were essentially a liaison between the DC government, which was congressionally appointed, and Congress, and they didn't want to give up that power. So there was people like Barry and Walter Fauntroy saying, it's always been about business, we need to go after these businesses, and so they were boycotting them. And then when there are the mass uprisings, the biggest targets of those uprisings are these businesses that often were members of the Board of Trade and were opposed to home rule. The other side of it is that after the uprisings, the city council had extensive hearings where they encouraged many members of the community to testify, and the Black United Front, which had been organized by Stokely Carmichael and was a large coalition of Black leaders from moderates to radicals like Stokely, came together and planned what they wanted people to say in these city council hearings so that they could give a united front as leaders were finally listening to them. And they said over and over and over again that what we want is community control, but also self-governance, which was, ultimately the cry for home rule. And you saw, once there was a home rule bill, some of that was incorporated through the creation of ANCs, or advisory neighborhood commissions, that incorporate not just self-governance, but that type of community input and control.
Did you look at everyone knows about the Montgomery bus boycott. Did you deal with the bus boycott here that Marian Barry participated in? Can you tell us just briefly about that? Because that's in addition to the cultural aspects of what you've heard about here, is that there were things that led up to what happened. It didn't just happen overnight. But the bus boycott.
So in 1966, Marian Barry, he's very new to town, but he organizes a bus boycott. They were planning to increase fare rates, I think by 5 or 10 cents.
From 20 to 25 cents for the bus.
Yeah. And so he organized, through SNCC and other organizations, a citywide bus boycott that was effective. And so that's just one of the examples of lots of different things. Derek mentioned the proposed highway that would have displaced tens of thousands of predominantly Black residents, mostly in Northeast DC. And there was an organization called the Emergency Committee for the Transportation Crisis that organized mass protests, and eventually, after home rule was implemented, was able to, instead of having these highways, get the metro passed, which was a huge success, but that also required really working to wear down a Southern segregationist congressman once again.
And for those of you who are younger or who may not have been in DC for a long time, the bus boycott was not a boycott against Metro. Metro didn't exist. The bus transit system, DC Transit, was owned by one man, a guy, O'Roy Chalk. And that was who the boycott was.
The buses were bad, but he was rich.
Yes, at that time.
If I could, Kojo, one of the things that this raises is why anyone would possibly be against home rule, right? And the fact of the matter is that home rule was actually really beneficial for a lot of people. So Kyla mentioned all these businesses that had opposed home rule. And so Marian Barry and other activists are boycotting those businesses, essentially saying you need to get on board and support home rule. Why do they have to do that to DC residents who own DC businesses? And the reason was because a lot of businesses in the district, these are white-owned businesses, had an open ear with these DC committees that are run by segregationists in Congress. And so they wanted to get something done. They'd head down to the Metropolitan Club. They'd get some scotch. They'd get some cigars. They'd work out a deal. And you didn't have to go to a city council. You didn't have to, move things through a legislature. You just worked it out between you and Mayor McMillan, which is, a lot of people call him the mayor of DC. Now, why did McMillan think that home rule was a good thing? As did Robert Byrd, by the way, the senator from West Virginia, who was over the DC Appropriations Subcommittee in the Senate. They use this whole city as a jobs program for their out-of-work constituents. And so, you'd bump into police in downtown Washington, D.C., which by the late 1960s is 68, 70% Black, right? And the police would have West Virginia twangs, or they'd have South Carolina drawls. Why? Because these senators and these members of Congress would literally say to out-of-work people, constituents in their offices back home, hey, you need a job, like the mine closed down, come to DC, we'll make you a teacher. Hey, the farm, hired tractors and there's no longer a place for you, come to DC, you can be a policeman. And so there are all these people who had a built-in reason for wanting to keep DC the way it was. But you also had this huge Black community that is fired by the idea of black power. The core idea of black power is self-determination for black people, right? And they're looking at themselves in 1970, they're saying, we are 70% of the population. And we should use those same tactics that we did down in Lowndes County, Alabama, down in Terrell County, Georgia, and we should take this place over by gaining democracy for the District of Columbia. And they're able to do that by linking up with liberals in Congress who, quite frankly, don't have a lot of love for McMillan or Byrd or some of these other people. But there's interest behind this. I'm sorry.
And it also came, you have to remember in the 60s, we had the Public Accommodations Bill of 64, and officially segregation, but more importantly, the Voting Rights Act of 65. People in the District of Columbia were seeing all this happening. They were not part of their government. And you mentioned briefly that these were white businesses, but I don't think we've said it enough already, so I'm going to say it. The racism was in your face. I went a couple of years ago down to Columbia, South Carolina, the University of South Carolina, and looked at Johnny Mack's congressman who had been, I think, in charge since 1938 over the city. He did exactly, I looked at all his papers. They brought out boxes and boxes of stuff. And he did do things that people would write him and say, my son needs a job. Tell him to call me and we'll get him in the sanitation department, whatever. White people ran the city and it was run by Johnny Mack. But the opposition was racial in many respects. And a very nice, I'm sure, white woman, Ms. Marie Lanford, wrote Johnny Mack in January of 1972 and said, I read your items in the Star, the Washington Star today, and do hope you do not go along with home rule for the district. We have too much of it now. Whenever the blacks get in power, they do nothing but for their own. I also think if they have 1/2 hour of black news on TV, why can't we have 1/2 hour of white news? D.C. is a federal city, and even though the black, she doesn't say blacks, even though the black are a majority, they seem to think they own it. All white people I know are against it. And Johnny Mack wrote, and this is one more, these are great letters. I couldn't get them all. But he wrote to someone in Virginia who was opposing home rule. And Johnny Mack wrote in July of 1972, I don't believe a true American would be elected to office in Washington if they should get home rule.
Well, the books that have been written by Tom and Kyla and Derek all have race as a central theme to what was going on in DC over politics. And when DC got home rule, as I recall, our first election for mayor was won by the initially appointed incumbent, Walter Washington, and then the next election was for mayor was won by Marian Barry, who was at the time running against the then council chairman, Sterling Tucker. But I think the issue of race was in many ways crystallized by the mayoralty of Marian Barry and what he was able to accomplish while he was mayor. So I'd like all of our panelists to talk a little bit about that and what they see the effect of that having on the general attitude towards home rule in DC before I get to the present day and how it's broken down along political lines between the Republican and Democratic parties. But Tom, I'll start with you.
And I would also say, given the hard right turn of the Republicans in the Congress today, should they win control of the Senate and the House next year and possibly have a Republican president, we could see more restrictions on home rule, not statehood or any more power. But Barry was elected. Walter Washington took the job as the appointed mayor, and President Johnson was appointing him, but they didn't want him, this new black person, to run the city. They wanted to choose the police chief or to run the police department, and so they were going to let a panel, somebody from the FBI, Secret Service, and someone else. They would choose the police chief because they weren't certain that the local people would enforce the laws, I guess. So that was kind of the thing that Walter Washington came in. He was a housing person. And then when Barry won, he did something that broke the mold. When Barry won in 1978 and took office in 79, he opened the doors to at the time, the district building, now the Wilson building. He opened those doors to black professionals and middle class who had never been in except to maybe complain about something or to try to get some help. He opened the jobs up to, as Barry used to complain, I got all these people jobs and they moved to the suburbs. That's why Prince George's County.
We created Prince George's County.
Yes, that's why Prince George's County exists, because people still live out there. But he opened the doors that, unlike any time in the past, instead of going to Johnny Mac for your child in Columbia, South Carolina to get a job in D.C., Marian Barry opened the doors. That's the biggest thing that he did. You often hear they did summer jobs. He did summer jobs in 1979. And that's important because it gave a lot of people access to both jobs, and people would spend time at Catholic University, these young people, 7 weeks or so. And that's important. But what Barry did is he changed the face of the government, which was basically all white.
And I want to ask you, Judy, because not only was Marian Barry and John Wilson veterans of SNCC on the council, there was also Frank Smith, who also referred to the Barry years as what he called the Barry Revolution in Washington, D.C. And a lot of that had to come from what was being nurtured from your activities in SNCC. Marian Barry's aggressive posture in terms of placing black people in top positions of the D.C. government and in positions of high positions of office had a lot to do with what he came out of. So talk about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've got it reminds me of, I was close friends with Ivanhoe Donaldson through SNCC. And so Ivanhoe was the one who, worked with Marian to...
Barry's top advisor.
I'm sorry?
Mary's
and
top-
became
He
his
was
deputy, and became his deputy mayor. His deputy mayor.
He was Barry's right hand and left hand.
Yes, he was. But officially, he was the deputy mayor. And see, we had thought about how do you bring SNCC values and SNCC grassroots organizing into regular electoral politics. But we started it not with Marian's campaign, with Julian's campaign, Julian Bond in Atlanta. And it was Ivanhoe who has always thought about, well, how do you bring these values and these organizing principles into regular politics, right? So in 1965, Ivanhoe convinces Julian Bond, who was then chair of the communications department at SNCC, where I'm still there. And so I become the person who runs the office. I'm also the only person in the office. I am the total staff of Julian Bond's office for the campaign, but Ivanhoe is the one who's running the campaign. This is 65, so it's before the 78 election of Marian Barry. And again, it is about how do you bring grassroots organizing style into electoral politics. But it's also about class, right? Because it's not just that you want to get another black face in high places. It is how do you get people who will represent just regular people? So that's what's happening, first of all, in Atlanta. And then Julian Bond wins, and I'm really surprised about that. But then I do some other things, and then I'm here in D.C., and Ivanhoe's running the campaign, and it's election day, and I suddenly realize, and I'm in the office, and I suddenly realize, oh my God, Marian could actually win this, right? And it's like, I know Marian from SNCC, right? Marian was in the Memphis office and doing whatever, organizing. I'm sorry, organize. I should be very clear when I talk about Marian.
That's right.
And
Listen,
organizing.
now,
no, let me finish.
We want to hear more about Marian
Yes,
Barry.
right. In any event, so it is now 78. It's election day, and I go into Ivanhoe's office and I said, "Oh my gosh, Ivanhoe, Marian could actually win this." And those of you who knew Ivanhoe looks at me and he says, "Well, of course, Richardson. What did you think?" But it amazed me that somebody who came out of SNCC could be the mayor of a major metropolitan area, right? But it's so then Cortland Cox, who is head of our SNCC Legacy Project now, he becomes, he goes into the budget office?
I think it was small business.
Small business, it was small business. And Johnny Wilson, is also on some other things. But the main thing is that what Cortland always talks about is that when Marian was there, if people came from, some of the, I'm trying to think of some of the banking industry people who wanted to do the bond issues and stuff. No, outside, banking people. If they wanted to do business with the city. What Cortland always talks about is that what Marian would say is, don't come back in here unless I see some black people representing your company. And that was always Marian's thing. For whatever else, Marian understood the importance of having black people who would represent black interests in pursuit of what was going on in the city. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
You mentioned that Barry, I always would tell people, they asked me about him because he did many things and he had all his troubles. I said the one thing he didn't have was discipline. And I suspect in the civil rights movement that probably went too.
But he had commitment. And see, and let me just say, I do need to say what was amazing about Marian with all the other stuff is that he understood about Southeast. The reason people kept reelecting him was because it's always about race and class and class. And so that's one of the things that Marian always understood.
Can I just add a quick statistic?
Yes.
Because, I mean, what Cortland did, especially at small business, was remarkable. We talk about the limits of what a black mayor can do in the 70s and 80s because all the money's moving out to the suburbs and stuff, right? But Cortland went into a small business administration, and when Marian Barry's elected in 1978, so they take office in 1979, Cortland walks into that office, and 7% of the city's business is with black firms. 7% of the contracts in a 70% black city, right? And Cortland, for those of you who know Cortland is hard crust, right? Cortland walks in and says, if you want your job, I think you need to get that up to at least 25% by the time re-election comes around, right? And by the time re-election came around, being good bureaucrats, folks got it up to 35%, right? And so what that does right then and there, though, is turns large numbers of black folks into millionaires, into upper middle class people. And yes, they all do end up moving to PG County, right? But it's literally this huge transfer of wealth. It's not just a summer jobs program, right? He's putting money in poor black people's hands, putting money in rich black people's hands, right? And that was a huge change.
Could I just say, just one quick thing. And Cortland is one of the two folks coming out of SNCC doing the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, out of which comes the Black Panther and the symbol of Black Panther, because what they're building is grassroots organizing in Lowndes County, Alabama, and that's Cortland and Jennifer. Yeah.
I was going to ask you a specific question, Kyla, but you might just want to jump in on this. Well, the more specific question is your book is titled The Unfinished Battle for Civil Rights in the Nation's Capital, and Marian Barry in many ways came to be symbolic of what can be accomplished under the leadership in terms of progress for black people. When you say unfinished, what are you talking?
So Tom mentioned the incredible opposition to home rule and how it was racialized, and read from two people putting that in very stark racial terms, that they don't want black people to be in charge of the nation's capital. That doesn't change when home rule arrives. And I think for all of the wonderful things that Barry did, he had personal flaws. And when those personal flaws came to very stark light, there were many people that said, this is why you can't trust black people to be in charge of the nation's capital, because it was international news. And that's not to say that they were right, but there was a huge backlash to that. And you did see in the 90s, when Barry's administration had a lot of problems, Congress is more than happy to step back in and to use that spectacle and the racism ingrained into it as a justification for the Financial Control Board, which increased the power that Congress had over DC. And I think if we fast forward just real quick all the way to the past year, you see how once again the increased association of crime or scandal with DC is looped back into more claims for congressional and even presidential control over the city.
My main job here is timekeeper, and I'm informed that we have 5 minutes left, and we have not yet talked about the road ahead. So during the course of the next 5 minutes before we start taking questions, try to incorporate into your remarks where we are now and what you see as the road
I
ahead.
would just say Barry is such a big figure. He took over the conversation, but we didn't talk about from the time we got home rule, the first elected council and the mayor in 1975. I want you to know what they did. They finally had power. They did handgun control, which was in place into the Supreme Court. They did rent control. They did the community development that Derek talked about. They created an office on aging. They created the Martin Luther King holiday celebration in 1975, which was not done nationally to 1986. The ferment of what was happening was so real in the 70s and then as Barry got there, the whole thing changes because he becomes an institution. But what's going to happen now, I have to tell you what I said at the start. There are people even today in the Congress who would take away what we have now.
And a lot of people who were opposed to home rule in the 1960s, up to the 1960s, were Democrats. Talk a little bit today about how the realignment of politics along party lines is affecting DC's prospects today. Either you, Kyla, or you, Derek.
1980 is the critical year. In 1978, Congress passes the DC Voting Rights Amendment. It's an amendment to the Constitution that would treat DC as though it were a state for purposes of representation in Congress. So we would have had, based on the census back then, 2 voting members of the House and 2 voting senators, right? Had the states ratified it. And when it's sent out to the states in 1979, it looks like people may ratify it. They don't seem to think one way or the other in a lot of these state legislatures that it's a good or a bad thing. And so what happens, though, is the American Legislative Exchange Commission, which, by the way, is working around the country today to have Republican state legislatures preempt the laws of Democratic cities in red states. Right? So Missouri is going after Kansas City. Texas is going after Houston, right? Literally replacing DAs or nullifying city laws. But ALEC back in 1979 said, we're going to lead the campaign to make sure the DC Voting Rights Amendment does not pass because we don't want 2 more urban, 2 more liberal, 2 more African-American senators in that chamber. And we don't want them 2 more in the House either, right? And they run this campaign, and one of the people that's a big backer of the campaign that doesn't think there should be 2 senators from D.C. is Ronald Reagan. And he and new right activists take over the Republican Party going into the 1980 election. So much so that the D.C. GOP goes to the Republican National Convention in Detroit and decides not even to offer a plank for D.C. To supporting the D.C. Voting Rights Amendment because they're scared that not only will it be rejected, but that the new right activists in the GOP will turn around and say, we actually want to repeal home rule. And from that point forward, the Republican Party, which for the 50s, the 60s, even in the 70s, had backed a constant expansion of DC's self-determination, first home rule, then the DC Voting Rights Amendment. The party changes course in every single year in its national platform. It either calls for no statehood, no DC Voting Rights Amendment, or when they get really chippy in the mid-1990s, they say we need to repeal home rule altogether.
And that, dear people, could be in the future. But I'm afraid we're out of time for our panelists, but we do have to give time to you to ask questions. And the first questions have to come from our students here from Duke Ellington.
The future Social Security payers.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Christian Sellers. I'm an 11th grader, and my question was, what was your experience interviewing proactive people compared to those that are deeply involved in politics?
Experience comparing what?
My question is to Mr. Kojo Nnamdi.
Oh, me?
Yes. I said, what was your experience interviewing provocative people compared to those that are deeply involved in politics?
Oh, I would think that all of the people I interview are provocative and involved in politics. I think that if you're talking about the difference between interviewing activists and interviewing politicians, it's very significant because the more I think of it, over the years, I have found that when I started interviewing politicians, I started with the belief that politicians were people who had a set of political principles and ran for office to carry forward those principles. As you can hear from the snickering in the background, what experience has taught me is that politicians are people who require office, and their primary concern is getting re-elected or elected. It's much less of a concern than their principles. On the other hand, when I have interviewed activists over the years, activists do tend to be people who align with a cause because of principle. And so for many, many years, I wanted to interview one person who I knew was associated with activists of principle, someone who was associated with Paul Robeson, someone who was associated with Nelson Mandela, someone who was associated with Martin Luther King Jr. And so when I got the opportunity to interview Harry Belafonte, who was closely associated with all three of those people, that for me was the peak of my broadcasting experience, because I think the difference between interviewing activists and interviewing politicians is that when you're interviewing activists, you're generally talking about principles that they're following or trying to follow. When you're interviewing politicians, it's usually about how can I stay alive.
But I think we need to say that there are people of goodwill who are in elected office. And if they're not in their elected office, it's the voters' fault.
True.
Uh-oh. Starting to knock things over here.
I soaked Kyla.
Next question.
Next question.
This is the first mic problem.
Okay, good evening. My name is Amaya Butler. I'm a junior, and my question is for Ms. Richardson. So what are the steps the younger generation can take in obtaining statehood as young activists?
Steps younger people can take.
Yeah. Well, first of all, organizing is really key, right? And so you can't do it alone. You have to figure out who else among you and among your friends, among your classmates, is really passionate about that. And passion is really key. I mean, one of the things in SNCC that we understood, because we were all, 18, 19, 20 years old. And so what was really important was the passion we had to see this through. Secondly, that we knew we needed each other to do this, and as many other people in our community. And we also needed to believe that it really could be done. And that's one of the things that's sometimes harder for young people now, because we saw things change. I mean, I thought I died and gone to heaven being in SNCC, because I thought I saw some stuff go. What didn't happen was the economic justice part of that. And so that's harder. But what I really got fueled by was the fact that everybody around me felt that we really could change conditions. Not necessarily that I would see it in my lifetime, right? I remember when we were doing, and it's a very quick story, when we were doing Eyes on the Prize, E.D. Nixon was one of the people who was really key as the NAACP person during the Montgomery bus boycott. When I was doing the interview with him early on for Eyes on the Prize, and he said, at first, I was doing this stuff for the kids who were going to come behind me, but then I decided, I want to see some of this stuff myself. But what you found all the way through all the older people who guided us, Amzie Moore, Mrs. Ella Baker, you can't talk about SNCC without Ms. Baker, all of those folks kept saying, I might not see the change in my lifetime, but if I do nothing, nothing changes. Always that somebody behind me then has to keep doing everything if I do nothing. So the main thing for me, I can't give you any steps. All the people, if you study how people have gotten this far, that helps. But the main thing is that you got to get other people who believe as passionately as you do, and then realize no matter what happens, you just got to keep moving, and even celebrate the small victories. Doesn't have to be big stuff. The small victories are really important.
And can I add one thing? Because I think we talked a lot about Marian Barry, the singular figure, right? Marian Barry was such an important activist in the city's history because he was part of a large group of activists. I sat down with Judy a couple of years ago and we counted how many SNCC activists had come to DC after 1965, and it was like 36, 38 of them, right? So it was never one person struggling alone. It was always a group of people working together to try and figure out how to move the larger society. And I want to point out that if you're interested in statehood, there are representatives from DC Vote here, some of my colleagues. There are folks from the League of Women Voters who have been in this struggle forever. Neighbors United for DC Statehood is an amazing organization that does this work, but get involved with other people so that you can work together to change the society. You can't do it by yourself. And if anyone's a great example of that, I certainly think is Judy and her comrades in SNCC.
Yeah, the push for statehood has been, in my view, I've said before, it's been too episodic. It's been up and down, kind of like a heartbeat when it needs to be sustained. And I wish that we could have some person with money give us, $25 million so we can have a political action committee, which would put some because Capitol Hill talks in green.
Hi, my name is London Wright, and originally my question was for Kojo Nnamdi, but I feel like after listening to the panel, this is for everyone. So how do you feel the rising crime rates in DC affect the resistance against the Home Rule Act?
I can take a stab at this.
Please do, Kyla.
So I mostly study the 50s and 60s, and one thing that is super striking is that politicians were complaining about DC crime rates and crime in DC and using it as a reason to not give DC home rule and to strip civil rights and civil liberties from Washingtonians when crime rates were very low. They would take a high-profile instance of crime, even if it was isolated, and say, this is why we can't have integration, this is why we can't have home rule, and this is why we can't trust black people in DC. I think we saw that at the beginning of this year when I know crime rates are high now, but at the beginning of the year, they weren't really high. And we still saw politicians rallying around a few high-profile instances of crime and using it to overturn democratically passed law in DC. So I think now, as crime rates are rising, we're gonna see that used more and more as a reason not only to not push for statehood, but to actually intervene in DC affairs more and more and strip our rights away.
And you will see it used by politicians whose crime rates in their own jurisdictions are higher than they are here in Washington, D.C.
But let me say the difference now, though, is that it's not people complaining, frankly, about black crime and black homicide. The carjackings, which we're having almost 1,000 of them already, we're over 900 now. Homicides are up, but people now feel like they can be shot, their car can be carjacked, they can be robbed. All these figures are off the charts, and so that does affect. No one is talking about statehood on a serious level at this point, in part because this is widespread. It's not, those black people across the river, the racism that undercuts everything in the city. It's everyone feels scared, and that's why it's a real problem for what the city is doing now.
But it's just super striking, right, that Democrats in Congress went from almost universally, like in the House of Reps, went from almost universally backing DC statehood as soon as 2022 to at the beginning of this year, I think it was 40 Dems voted in support of overturning laws that DC lawmakers elected by Washingtonians had passed. That's a huge 180, and it's directly related to crime, and it makes me concerned for the coming years. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Janiyah Bradner, and my question is for the whole panel. My question is, how can DC youth help give self-governance in DC?
I think the answer is in what Judy Richardson has already said, and that is that by becoming active, you want to see things change. At first, you start thinking that you want to see things change later on, but when you're young, and we've seen this around the world in terms of activism about climate change, when you're young, you want things to happen while you're still around to see them. And as Derek pointed out, there are people in this room that you can talk to before you leave about what it is you feel young people could be doing in your schools, in your organizations, and in your social circles to make sure that attention is drawn to the lack of voting rights and statehood for DC. It all has to do with what you want to do.
Yes, you're in school, educate yourself. In addition to all the classes you take sometimes that are boring, you wonder, why the hell do I have to do this or that? You educate yourself, and then you educate your friends together, and then you form coalitions, then you get things done.